My name is Becky Warren, and this lovely place, the Warren-Pohl farm, is where I spent my childhood growing up, learning about agriculture, learning about the history of Chelmsford, and having a grand time exploring every nook and cranny of this 54-acre gem. It was a wonderful place to grow up and learn about myself and what I would end up doing in my career of talking about history and talking about the natural environment. And I think all of those things come together at this Warren-Pohl farm. So this beautiful gem comes into the Warren family in the year 1699. And what we found out is that it was a wedding gift when a person by the name of Ruth Wheeler, her uncle owned this property, and she married a Warren. And as a wedding gift, Thomas Hinchman provided this little piece of land as a wedding gift in 1699. And since that point until the year 2020, it has been owned by a member of the Warren family and farmed as a farm during those years. So what's interesting is, I would say this property is typical of a New England farm, and that means it didn't have huge produce. It wasn't selling thousands and thousands of apples on the market in Boston, but what it produced was hay for their animals, because back in the 17 and 1800s you needed to have cows and sheep and goats and horses and chickens in order to feed your family for the year. And we know that there were apple trees and pear trees and peach trees that were throughout the property, all that would help sustain that Warren family from year to year and to survive in this early town of Chelmsford, which was established in 1655. Growing up here, I had my grandfather and two great aunts that were working the farm, and they would talk about the help that they would have over the years. And they talked about this one gentleman that lived down the street. His name was Polly Manso, and he was a good French-Canadian immigrant to the United States from Canada, and he was their blacksmith. And he would be able to make things out of metal that they might need on the farm. And he also helped with the haying and some of the other chores that went about and would be needed in order to make the farm produce. This was the former dairy barn and hen house, so they added on to it. This is where the cows would be, the workhorses would be, and then they added on chicken coops onto it, so it had chickens as well. Now, you look at it today and you're like, oh, that doesn't spook me at all, but gosh, a very large building when you're a little kid and you're walking by. Where I'm standing right now was the barn cellar. So this was the underneath, and when you have cows or animals, they're up on the first level, and the cellar is where all the manure goes. Every time you clean out the stalls, it would go into the barn cellar. And the barn cellar never had many light bulbs or a lot of light. It was always very dark. And my grandfather always had geese. I think they had many generations of geese called Gus and Gertie, because when I talk to relatives, they're like, oh, I remember Gus and Gertie. And I'm thinking, but I remember Gus and Gertie. So I think they just kept the same names with all the geese that they would have. But geese as watchdogs would always honk and put their neck down and hiss at you when you'd walk by. So here's this big building, dark barn cellar, and these geese come out of the cellar and they're honking at you, and we'd always as kids have to run by because we were so scared of the barn cellar. But we had fond memories of the upper level, milking the cows, and then there was a hay mow. There was a section where we would store the hay that we would get from the fields, and that's what would feed the cows in the winter time. But hay barns always have nice big beams, and they always have ropes. And so there was a rope swing the same one my father used as a young boy, swinging back and forth with the hay. We soon found that rope tucked up in the corner, and we unlatched it and we brought it down, and oh my goodness, we had hours and hours of fun of practicing swinging on a rope in the hay barn. And of course, if you fell, you just fell on the hay, and it was a nice soft landing. So fun memories in the old dairy barn, and scary memories of walking by that dark barn cellar with Gus and Gertie watching out for us. This is one of my favorite spots on the farm. It's what we call the pasture piece. It used to have cows when this farm, my grandfather Edwin and my great aunt Miriam Warren had cows. This would be where the cows would hang out in the summertime. So as a young child, I lived next door, and my grandfather and two great aunts lived closer to this property. And we would walk over, and a typical summer day would be, I couldn't wait to get out of the house and run down here to see what my grandfather was doing. Edwin Warren had gone to Mass Aggie, and he learned about agriculture, graduated from college, and decided he was going to continue with the tradition of running this farm. So I would run over here, and in my early years, he still had dairy cows. So there were a few days that I would run over on a school day and help feed the cows or milk the cows, and then run back home to get on the bus and go to school. And I never could quite figure out why no one wanted to sit next to me on the bus. Well, I soon figured out why, because there's a certain scent, a wonderful odor that comes from a good old dairy barn with cows. But you know, as a child, I didn't smell that difference. To me, that was a place of comfort, and I got to work next to my grandfather, which I have to say, I'm probably one of the luckiest kids around, that I had that older generation that I could talk to, that they could share stories and share things that they had observed over time. So I would come over and help with the dairy cows. The chickens and the hens were not here anymore when I was a child, but summertime was the best time, because we'd get on the tractors and we would mow and ted and rake and bale the hay out in the hay fields, and then load it all up and unload it in the barn. So little did I know that I had a great exercise regime happening when I was a kid, but it was just a way that I would spend my summer days out in the hay fields and working the property with my grandfather and my great aunt. And then when we didn't have cows anymore, we started baling hay, so this became one of the hay fields. And I will say, my grandfather and my great aunt, they always were working hard, but when we would bale this field, we'd always pause and stop to take in what you could see from this high spot on the farm. And he would point out certain things from this area. So you could see the barnyard, of course, and you could see the barn at the time, and the chicken house. So they had 1,000 hens and that would lay eggs, and people would wonder, well, how did a farmer make a living in those early days? And of course, you made the food that you would use for the family, but then you would make a little extra. And so they sold eggs, and they sold fruit, and they sold milk, and in order to make a living as farmers. So from this place, we could see the barn and be reminded of the early days of eggs and milk. And then looking across the field a little bit, the apple orchards. There are still remnant apple orchards here today. Great trees for climbing when you're a kid. For my grandfather, he talked about planting those apple trees back in the day when you could actually get a little explosive device, put it in the ground, light it, poof, and it would soften up the ground so you could plant your apple trees a lot easier way back when. So they were pretty smart in figuring out ways to get through this tough New England rocky soil in order to make it work. So apple orchards. Sharing a story that my grandfather mentioned, he and my grandmother were married on this farm in 1929. And they got married across the way on the hill where he had built a small cabin, a camp. And they were under the oak trees having the service. And the cows were out in these fields just grazing. And the story goes that they would hear the cows lowing, mooing during the ceremony. So I don't know if they were speaking out against, I don't think so. I think they were celebrating this marriage of my grandfather and my grandmother. And another relative was married here on that hill as well. So from this vantage point, I'm reminded of my relatives starting their new lives and getting married on this property. And then looking over to Robin's Hill, which is a high hill here in Chelmsford, and the Native Americans used that hill. Robin was named for one of the Native American folks that was in this early part of Chelmsford, and the early settlers and the Native Americans were quite cordial, and they shared crops. So at Robin Hill, there were cornfields and there were vegetables that were grown there by the Native Americans, by Robin and his family, and they were shared with the early settlers. And right here from this pasture hill, you can see Robin's Hill and know that that was the start of the early history of Chelmsford. And then I'm reminded of just being out here on a 90-degree hot summer day and baling hay, and my friends saying, "What are you doing out in the middle of a field on a hot, hot summer day?" Almost any day out in this field, there would be a little bit of a breeze. I don't know why it happens, but it does. And so even though it might be really, really warm, there usually was a little bit of a breeze to cool us off. And when I was a younger person baling hay, and we took a break, there's a spring on the further end of this property, and we would traipse through into the woods. We'd go to that natural spring. There would be a little cup there that stayed there all year, and my grandfather would move the leaves off the top of the water, and oftentimes a frog jumped away at the same time, and he would dip that cup into that spring water, and he'd take the first sip, and he'd always say, "Oh, what good water." And then we'd all get our sip of water. And I have to say, it was the coldest water I had drinking in a long time, and you could get brain freeze if you drank too fast. So you would always sip that ice cold spring water. It did have a very special taste. And I can still remember the times of sharing water at that spring, getting replenished, and then coming on back out here into the hay fields to load those bales of hay and get them into the barn before the sun went down. So this little spot on this pasture has evokes a lot of memories for me, and it is able to tell some tales of the early days of the farm. When my grandfather passed away in 1986, he gave the farm to his two children, my father, Franklin Warren, and my aunt, Martha Warren-Pohl. And so they jointly owned the farm from 1986 onward. And you know, the rest of us were still working. We had jobs, we were in school, and we were trying to keep up with the farm and to keep it productive with making hay. And we did that for many, many years, and it soon became evident that our 1940s farm-all tractors weren't quite able to keep up, and neither were we, with all the tasks at hand of just keeping hayfields open and keeping the production going. So there were some tough decisions that needed to be made. One of the last things we wanted to see was to see this property developed into housing. And so thankfully the town of Chelmsford over the years had approached the families and asked if we were good with keeping it as open space, if we were ever thinking of selling, to please let them know. And so in 2019, we let them know that there was a change. We weren't able to keep up with the farming, and keeping up with the farming meant the property taxes were taxed as agriculture use, not private residential use. So it made it very affordable in that sense to pay the property taxes on 54 acres of land in the center of Chelmsford. By farming it, we were able to get that tax break. If we weren't going to be able to farm it anymore, we wouldn't get that tax break. And so thankfully the town of Chelmsford was interested in purchasing it as open space. Heartbroken, I was anyway, because of my childhood growing up here, what this land has meant to the Warren family for over 300 years. But then I thought about the fact that it was going to be preserved, and preserved for future generations. So folks that didn't have the opportunity I did to take a walk and listen to a hawk soaring up in the sky, or watch deer go through the meadows, they would have this opportunity now that I had as a child to see this place, appreciate this place, and walk on the land that the same family had been tending and lovingly tending for 300 years. So one of the ways that this land was preserved for future generations was through the Community Preservation Act. And there's a community preservation committee in most towns in Massachusetts. And simply what you're doing is taking a little bit of everybody's real estate taxes, and you're putting it into a separate pot of money that can be used for three things: open space, affordable housing, and historic preservation. And the town of Chelmsford voted to have CPC funds, and they have done a lot of great things for the town of Chelmsford. They have bought other open space properties, but ultimately CPC funds were used to purchase this land for the residents of Chelmsford, for them to enjoy and use as open space. Without those CPC funds, it would be very difficult for a town to have money to fix a historic building, or provide affordable housing, or purchase land for open space when there are so many other priorities in any town. This designates that money for such causes. And this is a success story of using CPC funds. One of the caveats is it's open space, and there will be a conservation restriction, an official document that gets put in place so that it can be monitored and make sure that things don't change and happen here. And another entity has to hold that conservation restriction. And the Chelmsford Land Conservation Trust will be holding that conservation restriction, and will share the responsibility of making sure that this land doesn't change or isn't used for the intended good of open space and agriculture. So we are standing at a brand new beaver pond, or the start of a beaver pond. Beavers have come on to the Warren-Pohl farm just in the last couple of years, and they have built a couple of dams. The other ones were not to their liking, so they built a dam on one of the brooks. The water got a little bigger, it flooded out some of the hay fields, and then the beavers seemed to disappear. Like, the dam was still there, but there wasn't activity. And just a few months ago, this appeared. So they have moved to a new part of the neighborhood. They've just moved downstream to a place more to their liking. And what they've done is built their own dam through Putnam Brook. Putnam Brook runs right through the middle of the Warren-Pohl farm, has always been here. And they have cut down branches and trees just that were growing here to create this natural dam. And what they're doing is making a pond to make it a habitat that's good for them, where they can get food and shelter. So this wasn't underwater where these trees are that they've cut down. They were on the edge of the brook. They have gnawed those off, so they'll use some of it to build the dam, but they'll also use part of it for food. None of that tree that they cut down goes to waste. They'll use the strong supportive stuff to build the dam and to fix the dam over time. And then they use the smaller twigs for food, and that's what they eat over the winter. Look at the size of the chips of wood that have come off that. That's their tooth marks as they're biting through. They're leaving their tooth marks behind. How many times have we've gone past a pond or a waterway, and here's one that's actually being formed in front of our eyes. What an opportunity. So we were just looking at the Beaver Dam, and while that's pretty impressive to see that little pond starting, that's not the only impact that the dam has created. What you've got are former hayfields over here that are now saturated with water and probably going to get a little deeper and a little deeper and turning into probably a little bit larger pond. And where I'm standing is another hayfield. So just being a little bit higher in elevation, this will stay dry. This could continue to be a hayfield or a dry spot of land for people to walk on. And then the difference of what lowland will do. Once there's a little stoppage in the brook, it's basically flooding this entire lowland. You know, it doesn't just impact beavers. My cousin lives right close by, and they are now seeing wood ducks and great blue herons flying into this property and using this waterway that we have never seen before. So it makes for an interesting position to think about. Hayfields supported agriculture, supported the Warren-Pohl farm for 300 years in some form of agriculture, but nature has always been here. We have always seen foxes and lately turkeys and deer and coyote and hawks and all kinds of wildlife. So this is just one next step to a little different form of wildlife, and it's very exciting. It's an exciting time to watch this transformation happen right now. You're in the middle of Chelmsford Center, Route 27, that's Route 27 that we're hearing, Acton Road, Route 4, Boston Road, another busy road, and yet this little oasis is the perfect place to grow up as a young child. When they joke about the back 40, I really did have the back 40, and we would be sent out, you know, to go play, and we'd be playing in these brooks, we'd be playing in the barn, we'd be climbing trees, and we'd come home for dinner at night. So it was just a really, really special place to be and grow up. So I've been thinking about my ancestors and what they would think. And you know, when the farm first came into the family, it was a wedding gift, right? And it has diminished in size over years, but in true traditional New England ways, it always went to the first son. So the first son would get this piece of property. The rest of the kids had to go somewhere else and figure out how to find their own farm or their own job, or, you know, go elsewhere. And so I often think about how did I end up being so lucky to be a part of this? Because there were times that the first son did receive it, but the first son decided to move somewhere else. And so it went to the second son. Or the first son was ill or was sick and then had his brother take it on. And then I think it's kind of cool that my great-grandfather sold it to my grandfather and my great-aunt. So a brother and sister ran this place. So there's a woman that becomes part of the story. I mean, they're always part of the story, but she was a landowner in the 1920s of buying this property with her brother to sustain and keep the farm active. So I know it was farming, you know, that's what they did here, but I don't think they would have a problem at all with it being like we're seeing today, like the evolution of a beaver dam and a beaver pond. We get to watch that happen in front of our eyes. They appreciated nature, and I learned my appreciation of nature from them. Today we're listening to an owl talk to us, a barred owl, while we're standing here. And if future generations and people of Chelmsford and far off can come to a place and hear an owl when they're standing in a field, watch a beaver dam being built in front of them, I think I am good in my heart with knowing it might not be agriculture completely anymore, but it's going to be a place, a safe haven for wildlife to live in their natural place. And that makes me feel good. That makes me feel good.